Trump has been. For 18 minutes, the president last night tried to convince Americans the sky is green, that trees can walk. He yelled at the camera and said that things are somehow going great, even though costs are up. He said he's doing a great job in office, all of which is obviously false, and the American people didn't buy it. It was clear watching the speech that the president didn't want to be there. The only thing Americans saw last night was a very rich president trapped in a bubble, forced by his advisors to give a speech he didn't want to give. It's like your cousin who can't sit still for a Christmas photo. Only this is the President of the United States.
Did you see that? Because this is what we all need to be comprehending with absolute clarity at this precise moment in history. Senator Chuck Schumer just declared that Trump lives in a bubble, completely disconnected from the reality everyday Americans are seeing and feeling. And honestly, how can anyone dispute that characterization when we're watching a billionaire stand in the opulent diplomatic reception room of the White House, literally screaming at the American people that everything is fantastic while they're breaking their backs trying to figure out which bills they can pay this month and which ones have to wait because the system has been so thoroughly rigged against them? This is the moment the mask slips entirely, and we see the grotesque pageantry of plutocratic delusion on full display, because Trump just delivered what amounts to an 18-minute temper tantrum on national television, insisting the sky is green and trees can walk, while a wave of recent polls shows that Americans are distressed by the cost of living and unhappy with Trump's efforts to steer the country toward prosperity. An NPR-PBS News Marist poll found that 61% of respondents said the economy was not working well for them personally, while 70% said the cost of living where they live is not very affordable, or not affordable at all, and yet this man has the audacity to stand there and tell us prices are falling rapidly when the actual data tells us something completely different. Because here's what's actually happening in the real world, where actual human beings are trying to survive, and it's absolutely infuriating that we even have to spell this out. But the year-over-year inflation rate was 3% in September 2025, which is virtually the same as the 3% in January 2025, when Trump began his second term, and the government's consumer price index shows that prices have risen every month since April, and in September, the rate of inflation hit 3%, which means that for all his bluster about crushing inflation and making America affordable again, the needle hasn't moved at all, but what has moved are the goalposts of acceptable discourse, because we're now living in a political reality where a president can simply invent an alternate universe and expect the rest of us to accept it, while 2/3 of Americans say rising prices have made their financial situation worse, including 19% who say they're much worse off. And these aren't abstract statistics. These are real families making impossible choices about whether to buy groceries or pay for their child's medicine, whether to fix the car or keep the heat on, because that's the actual affordability crisis that Trump dismisses as a hoax perpetrated by Democrats. And wait, because the sheer magnitude of the deception gets worse when you actually examine what this administration is claiming versus what their own data reveals, and this is where the intellectual dishonesty becomes so brazen, it's almost breathtaking in its audacity, because Trump claimed he secured a record-breaking $18 trillion in investment into the United States, but has not provided evidence for that figure, and the White House website cites a much smaller figure of $9.6 trillion, and that appears to include commitments made during Biden's presidencies, which is just classic authoritarian playbook behavior, inflating numbers, making grandiose claims that crumble under the slightest scrutiny, because the goal isn't to inform the public, the goal is to create a narrative of unparalleled success that exists only in the fever dream of Mar-a-Lago strategy sessions, while the rest of us are watching our purchasing power evaporate in real time. The historical resonance here should terrify anyone who understands how democracies collapse, because what we're witnessing isn't just political spin, it's the systematic delegitimization of empirical reality itself, and this connects to a much deeper pathology in conservative politics that treats facts as malleable instruments of power rather than constraints on governance. And if you think I'm being hyperbolic, consider that Trump's own tariffs that he continues to tout are driving prices higher, as Federal Reserve Chair Jerome Powell reported, saying that inflation growth is happening entirely in goods as opposed to services, and that the growth is entirely in sectors where there are tariffs. So the president is literally implementing policies that are making Americans poorer while simultaneously taking a victory lap and calling it economic genius, and the media just both sides this catastrophe, as if there's some legitimate debate to be had about whether up is down and black is white. This isn't about partisan disagreement. This is about a fundamental assault on our capacity to have a shared reality. And you know what's even more galling in this entire spectacle is how perfectly it encapsulates the conservative project of gaslighting working people about their own lived experiences. Because political consultant Frank Luntz says Trump risks appearing out of touch if he continues to claim that affordability is a hoax when Americans feel like they're paying more and actually do pay more. And even Marjorie Taylor Greene, a stalwart Trump ally, had to admit that everyone's bills have either stayed the same or gone up, saying you can't gaslight people and tell them that their bills are affordable. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain Trump's version of events would shatter a normal person's brain. But here we are watching a man who has never had to choose between feeding his family and paying rent lecture, struggling Americans about how great they have it, while Americans continue to feel the squeeze of high prices and wages that are not keeping up with things getting worse and increased costs. And this is the billionaire bubble that Schumer is talking about, this hermetically sealed reality where consequences don't exist for the wealthy, where economic pain is an abstraction discussed over $18,000 dinners rather than the grinding daily humiliation of poverty. Let's talk about what this bubble actually looks like in practice, because the aesthetics matter here, and they reveal everything about the moral bankruptcy of this moment. And remember, Trump delivered this speech from behind a lectern flanked by Christmas trees with a portrait of George Washington behind him, appropriating all the symbols of American respectability and tradition to sell a fundamentally un-American message that your suffering is imaginary, that the data contradicting your bank account is more reliable than your own perception. The address had the feel of a Trump rally speech without the rally, and unlike the often sedate primetime addresses of past presidents, Trump spoke loudly throughout his speech at times, seeming to shout. Because when you're trapped in a bubble of your own construction, you have to yell to penetrate it. You have to assert dominance over reality itself, through sheer volume and performative confidence, and this is what authoritarianism sounds like in its American iteration. Not jackboots and torchlight parades, but a real estate huckster, screaming about phantom successes while the foundation crumbles beneath everyone's feet. The comparison to Weimar Germany might seem overwrought until you consider how economic desperation combined with reality denial creates the preconditions for fascism, because when people are struggling and their leaders tell them everything is fine while their pockets are empty, they start looking for scapegoats, and Trump helpfully provides them, blaming immigrants for housing costs, when economists and housing experts reject that notion, pointing instead to housing shortages and elevated mortgage rates as the primary drivers of rising costs. And some have warned that mass deportations could worsen the problem by further delaying the construction of new homes, given the crucial role immigrants play in the construction industry. But facts don't matter when you're constructing a nationalist mythology that requires villains and heroes rather than structural analysis and systemic critique. This is how demagogues operate throughout history. They take legitimate grievances about material conditions and redirect them toward manufactured enemies, while the actual architects of suffering, the billionaire class that Trump represents, laugh all the way to their offshore accounts. And here's where Schumer's critique becomes even more devastating, because he's not just calling out Trump's disconnect from reality, he's identifying it as the central feature of Republican governance in the Trump era. And Schumer says frankly they are in a billionaire's bubble, that it's a small group of greedy billionaires which always sought to control the Republican Party, and with Donald Trump they've succeeded, and these billionaires are running the show, plain and simple. Which is the analysis we desperately need right now, because this isn't about Trump's personal failings or his psychological deficiencies. It's about class warfare prosecuted through the mechanisms of democratic government, and the billionaire bubble isn't just a metaphor, it's a literal description of how power operates in late-stage capitalism, where the ultra-wealthy are so insulated from consequence, so removed from the material conditions that govern normal human existence, that they genuinely cannot comprehend why anyone would be upset about grocery prices increasing by double-digit percentages. The sheer contempt embedded in Trump's performance last night should radicalize anyone who's been paying attention, because when he rattles off the price of eggs and Thanksgiving turkeys as evidence of his success while grocery prices are up, with consumer price index data showing that a far greater number of grocery items have increased in price since he returned to office than have decreased, and average grocery prices were up about 2.7% from September 2024 and about 1.4% from January 2025. He's not just lying, he's performing class domination. He's demonstrating that he can say whatever he wants regardless of truth, because power insulates him from accountability. and this is what the billionaire bubble protects: the ability to construct narrative divorced from reality to impose your version of events on a captive audience, because you control the megaphone and the platforms and the means of narrative production, while working people have nothing but their increasingly worthless paychecks and their justified rage. Let me be absolutely clear about what's at stake here, because we're not talking about normal political disagreement about tax rates or regulatory frameworks. We're talking about whether empirical reality itself has any purchase in our political discourse, and the answer under Trump is increasingly no. And this connects to every authoritarian movement in modern history, from Mussolini's fascism to Stalin's communism, to the various right-wing dictatorships that have plagued Latin America. The consistent feature is the subordination of truth to power, the insistence that the leader's word supersedes observable fact, and in the first hours of his administration, Trump's absurd claims about the size of the crowd at his inauguration were widely ridiculed, but in retrospect, the charade was a harbinger of an administration that bucked fact as an instrument of political power, and what began as a joke about crowd sizes has metastasized into a full-blown epistemic crisis where millions of Americans no longer share a common factual foundation. And that makes democratic governance essentially impossible, because how do you deliberate about policy solutions when you can't even agree on the nature of the problem? The economic data is so damning, it's almost comical, except that real human beings are suffering under the weight of these lies because Trump and drug makers have touted a variety of deals, but it's far from clear whether consumers have benefited, and little data is available to substantiate Trump's broad claims or know whether companies have followed through on their promises. And meanwhile, health insurance premiums for Affordable Care Act enrollees are expected to increase by more than 100% to an average of $1,900 monthly, after Congress failed to extend ACA subsidies, but Trump just declares mission accomplished and expects us to applaud while families go bankrupt from medical debt. And this is the logical endpoint of trickle-down economics, married to authoritarian politics, the complete abandonment of any pretense that government exists to improve people's material conditions, rather than to enrich those who already have everything. What makes this moment particularly dangerous, and I want you to really sit with this because it's crucial, is that public polling shows most U.S. adults are frustrated with his handling of the economy, as inflation picked up after his tariffs raised prices and hiring slowed. Republicans lost heavily in elections in November for the mayor of New York and governorships in Virginia and New Jersey, which means the political backlash to Trump's failed policies is beginning to materialize, but rather than adjusting course or acknowledging reality, the administration is doubling down on the gaslighting, insisting that what you see with your own eyes is fake news, and what they tell you from their bubble is truth. And this is how democracies die, not with a bang, but with a steady erosion of the shared epistemic foundations that make collective self-governance possible, and we're watching it happen in real time, with a president who literally cannot admit that costs are rising, because to do so would puncture the fantasy of his own competence. The class dynamics here are so naked, so undisguised, that future historians will look back in amazement at how obvious the grift was, and yet how many people fell for it, or at least acquiesced to it because this billionaire's bubble is so limited, they only talk to each other, and they don't even think of the harm they're doing to average people, or they don't want to know about it, so they listen to one another and refuse to understand working people, and that is sickening. And this is exactly right, because the bubble isn't just about being out of touch, it's about willful ignorance, weaponized indifference, the conscious choice to not see the suffering that your policies create, because acknowledging that suffering would require either changing course or admitting moral culpability, and the billionaire class is constitutionally incapable of either. So instead we get performative empathy and empty gestures like the warrior dividend for military members, which Trump suggested his tariffs would fund even though they are partly responsible for boosting consumer prices. So he's literally taking money out of American consumers' pockets through tariffs, and then giving a tiny fraction of it back to service members, as if that's some kind of magnanimous gift rather than a transparent electoral bribe. And you want to know what's truly maddening about watching this spectacle unfold? It's that the Democratic establishment, for all its rhetorical opposition, still hasn't fully grasped the nature of the threat or articulated a sufficiently radical alternative, because Schumer's right to call out the bubble. But where's the comprehensive plan to burst it? Where's the agenda that would actually redistribute wealth and power in a way that addresses the material desperation driving our political crisis? Because pointing out that Trump is lying is necessary but insufficient when people are drowning in debt and can't afford housing and are watching their children's futures evaporate in real time. They don't just need fact checks, they need material relief. They need structural transformation. They need someone to say that the entire system is broken and here's how we're going to fix it. and Democrats keep running on competent managerialism when the moment demands revolutionary restructuring. Think about the profound alienation embedded in Trump's speech when he says 11 months ago, "I inherited a mess and I am fixing it," while the consumer price index stood at 3% in September 2025, which is virtually unchanged from the 2.9% figure reported in December 2024, Biden's final full month in office, and was also at 3% in January 2025. So by his own administration's data, nothing has changed, but he's constructed this entire narrative of salvation and restoration, and the people who are struggling are supposed to just ignore their bank accounts and trust that the billionaire in the White House knows better than they do about their own financial situations. And this is gaslighting as governing philosophy. This is reality distortion as policy, and it only works as long as enough people either believe the lie or feel too powerless to challenge it. And that's why movements like the one we need to build right now are so essential, because collective action is the only thing that punctures the bubble that forces the powerful to acknowledge the reality they've been denying. The broader implications here extend far beyond economic policy, because what we're witnessing is the consolidation of oligarchic power using the instruments of democratic government. And when Donald Trump became president, billionaires got control of the Republican Party, and Elon Musk and Donald Trump are in the billionaire bubble, which is the structural analysis we need to be foregrounding in every conversation about contemporary politics, because this isn't about personalities or communication strategies. It's about class interests and power relations, and who gets to define reality and who has to suffer under someone else's definition. And the billionaire bubble exists specifically to insulate the wealthy from accountability, to allow them to accumulate more and more, while everyone else fights over scraps. And anyone who tells you that this is normal or acceptable, or just politics as usual, is either deluded or complicit. Consider the absolute cynicism required to stand before the American people, while 61% of Americans report spending more on groceries and dining out compared to a year ago, with costs in those categories rising $209.45 a month on average, and tell them that prices are falling rapidly and everything is great, because what Trump is really saying is that your perception doesn't matter. Your suffering doesn't matter. The only thing that matters is what I tell you matters, and this is the psychology of authoritarianism, the insistence on the leader's infallibility, the demand for loyalty to narrative over reality, the conversion of empirical questions into loyalty tests. And if you say that costs are rising, you're not just wrong, you're disloyal, you're fake news, you're an enemy of the people, and this is how you destroy the possibility of democratic accountability, by making disagreement itself an act of betrayal. The speech last night was supposed to be Trump's opportunity to reset the narrative, to convince Americans that his economic policies are working, but instead what we got was a rehash of his recent messaging that has so far been unable to calm public anxiety about the cost of groceries, housing, utilities, and other basic goods, and the reason it can't calm that anxiety is because the anxiety is justified. It's a rational response to material conditions, and no amount of performative confidence can change the fact that Americans are spending more of their income on food than they have in 30 years, and living comfortably costs a lot more than it used to, with prices up almost 21% since the pandemic first began, requiring an extra $210 per every $1,000 someone used to spend. And these numbers represent actual human suffering, actual families making actual sacrifices, and Trump's bubble prevents him from seeing any of it, or maybe he sees it and simply doesn't care, which might be even worse. And here's where I want to connect this to the longer arc of conservative politics and neoliberal governance, because what we're seeing isn't new. It's the apotheosis of trends that have been building for 40 years since Reagan told us that government is the problem and the market will solve everything, and what we've gotten instead is the complete capture of government by market interests, the transformation of democracy into plutocracy, the reduction of citizenship to consumerism, and Trump is just the most garish manifestation of these deeper pathologies. But he's not the cause, he's the symptom, and if we don't address the underlying disease of wealth, inequality, and corporate power, and the financialization of everything, then removing Trump won't solve anything. We'll just get a more competent, more palatable version of the same oligarchic project, and that's why the critique has to be systemic, not personal. The fact that Schumer has to state the obvious, that Trump lives in a bubble, disconnected from reality, tells you everything about how far we've fallen as a political culture, because in a functioning democracy, this would disqualify someone from leadership. The inability to perceive or acknowledge basic facts about how people are living would be automatically disqualifying, but instead we're stuck relitigating whether reality exists, whether facts matter, whether the president has any obligation to tell the truth, and meanwhile roughly 14% of U.S. households reported food insecurity on average between January and October, and in New York City 40% of local families can't afford their weekly food costs, and these aren't statistics, these are neighbors and community members and fellow citizens who are being systematically immiserated by an economic system that serves the interests of a tiny fraction of the population, while everyone else scrambles to survive. What's required at this moment isn't moderation or compromise or reaching across the aisle to find common ground with people who deny basic reality. What's required is clarity about the stakes and courage to name the enemy, and the enemy isn't just Trump or the Republican Party. The enemy is the entire structure of contemporary capitalism that concentrates wealth and power in fewer and fewer hands while imposing austerity and precarity on everyone else, and the billionaire bubble that Schumer describes is both literal, in the sense that Trump and his allies live in a completely different material world than most Americans, and metaphorical in the sense that the ideology of free market fundamentalism creates a conceptual bubble that prevents its adherents from seeing the harm they cause, and bursting both versions of that bubble requires political movements that are willing to challenge the fundamental assumptions of our economic order. The 21st century is going to be defined by whether we can build democracies that actually serve the material interests of ordinary people, or whether we're going to continue sliding toward oligarchic authoritarianism dressed up in the language of freedom and choice, and every speech like Trump's last night, every instance of blatant reality denial, every assertion that struggling people are actually doing fine, is a step toward that authoritarian future, because once you've severed the connection between governance and material outcomes, once you've made it acceptable for leaders to simply invent their own reality, then there's no limiting principle, there's no check on power, there's nothing preventing the complete subordination of truth to whatever narrative serves the interests of the powerful, and that's not hyperbole, that's just reading the historical record and understanding where these dynamics lead. So when Schumer says Trump lives in a billionaire bubble fantasy, what he's really identifying is the fundamental contradiction of our age, that we have a government ostensibly of by and for the people being run by people who have no connection to the people, no understanding of their lives, no interest in their well-being, and the only way to resolve that contradiction is through mass mobilization, popular resistance, the kind of sustained collective action that makes it impossible for the bubble to sustain itself, because eventually reality breaks through, eventually the gap between what they're saying and what people are experiencing becomes too wide to bridge with propaganda, and we might be approaching that point as 52% of Americans thought the economy was getting worse under Trump, but approaching the point isn't the same as crossing it, and that's why the work of political education and organizing and consciousness raising is so urgent right now, because the bubble only bursts when enough people decide to puncture it together, and that's the project we need to be about, building the power to make them see us, to make them feel us, to make them unable to ignore the reality they've been denying. This is the fight of our generation, whether we're going to allow ourselves to be governed by people who live in a fantasy world of their own creation, or whether we're going to insist on democracy grounded in material reality, responsive to actual human needs, accountable to the people it's supposed to serve, and speeches like Trump's make the stakes crystal clear. There's no middle ground here either. We accept the bubble and everything it represents, or we burst it and build something better, and I know which side I'm on, and I know which side anyone who cares about justice and dignity, and the basic idea that government should improve people's lives rather than immiserate them, should be on, and it starts with calling out the bubble for what it is, a deliberate construction designed to insulate power from accountability, and it continues with the hard work of building alternatives, organizing communities, articulating a vision of what could be if we had the courage to demand it, and it ends only when we win.